A young reporter thought he could humiliate Clint Eastwood, but he never saw this comeback coming. The ballroom at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel was a spectacle of elegance. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm light, their reflections bouncing off gold-trimmed walls. The air was thick with the scent of aged whiskey, expensive perfume, and the subtle tension that always lingered when Hollywood's elite gathered under one roof. Guests in tailored suits and designer gowns floated from table to table, their voices a controlled murmur of industry gossip, forced laughter, and backhanded compliments. Some were here for the cause. Tonight's gala was in support of veterans' mental health initiatives, but for many it was just another photo op, a chance to be seen, to network, to reinforce their place in the industry's pecking order. And then Clint Eastwood walked in. No entourage, no grand entrance. Just him. In a well-fitted black suit, hands tucked casually into his pockets, exuding the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need an introduction. At 94 years old, he moved slower than he used to, but there was still something in his posture, something in the way his eyes scanned the room that commanded respect. Conversations shifted mid-sentence. Eyes darted in his direction. A few guests whispered to their companions. He wasn't the kind of celebrity you fawned over. You acknowledged him. You respected him. He approached a small group near the bar, greeted a couple of longtime friends with a firm handshake, and leaned in slightly to hear their conversation over the soft jazz playing in the background. He wasn't one for small talk, but he had a way of making people feel like what they were saying mattered, a rare trait in this room. Across the ballroom, a young journalist named Brandon Keller was watching. He wasn't a household name. But in the world of political commentary, he was making a name for himself as the fearless, no-nonsense voice of a new generation. His articles, mostly attacks on outdated conservative figures, had gotten him a decent following on social media. Tonight he saw an opportunity. Clint Eastwood was a relic, a man from an era that no longer fit the Hollywood narrative. Keller was going to make a statement, but something in his expression, a mix of arrogance and excitement, hinted at the fact that he had already decided how this confrontation would go. He wasn't here for a discussion. He was here for a takedown, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. Brandon Keller straightened his tie, grabbed his phone, already set to record, and made his way through the crowd. He wasn't nervous. He was confident, too confident. This wasn't just about calling out an old actor's outdated views. It was about making a scene, a viral moment. As he approached, the energy at the bar shifted slightly. A few guests took a step back, sensing an interruption. Clint Eastwood, in the middle of listening to a war veteran's story, barely acknowledged the young man's presence. That only fueled Keller's determination. He cleared his throat, flashing a tight-lipped smile. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, voice loud enough to draw attention. "Brandon Keller, the Sentinel Review. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Eastwood gave him a glance, brief, unreadable, then turned back to his conversation. Keller didn't like that. He took a small step closer. "I'll make it quick," he added, forcing a chuckle. "I just wanted to get your thoughts on, well, Hollywood's changing landscape. You've been in the industry for over 60 years. Do you think people like you still have a place in it?" The subtle jab was intentional. The words "people like you" hung in the air, heavy with implication. A few guests nearby turned their attention to the exchange. Someone set their drink down a little too loudly. Even the bartender, mid-pour, paused for half a second. Clint Eastwood finally looked at him. His gaze was steady, like a man deciding whether or not something was worth his time. Keller pressed on. "Because he continued, Hollywood is evolving. The old ways of thinking, the outdated masculinity," he made a vague hand gesture. "Conservative values. A lot of people believe it's time to move forward, that guys like you are out of touch with what modern audiences want." There it was, the line Keller had been waiting to say. The setup was perfect. He was on camera, in front of an audience, standing toe-to-toe with a Hollywood legend. This was his moment. He could already picture the headline. Clint Eastwood finally called out. Watch him stumble over his own ignorance. But that headline was about to fall apart because Clint Eastwood wasn't the one stumbling. For a second, Clint Eastwood just looked at him. Not with anger, not with offense, just the kind of stare that made a man question if he'd made the right decision. A slow, steady silence stretched between them, pulling in the attention of everyone within earshot. Then Eastwood sighed. Not the kind of sigh that came from exhaustion, but the kind that signaled complete and utter disinterest. He reached for his drink, took a small sip, then set it back down before finally speaking. "You rehearsed that one, didn't you?" A chuckle rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, low but unmistakable. Keller's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "I'm just asking the questions people want answers to," he shot back. Eastwood tilted his head slightly. People. He repeated as if tasting the word. Or just you. Keller hesitated. That wasn't part of the script in his head. The veteran actor leaned forward slightly, resting an elbow on the bar. You think the world just moves forward because some guy with a keyboard says so? That real change happens because somebody like you points a finger and says that's old. Throw it out. Keller opened his mouth, but Eastwood didn't give him the chance. Let me tell you something, kid. His voice was steady, measured, the same tone he used in 100 films when delivering a line that sent chills through the screen. You don't erase the past just because you don't like it. You learn from it. You build on it. You take what worked, fix what didn't, and move forward. That's progress, not whatever the hell this is. He gestured vaguely at Keller, mimicking the young man's earlier dismissive hand wave. This time the chuckle from the crowd was louder. Someone clapped. Keller's face reddened, but he wasn't ready to back down. With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood, he said, voice a little tighter. It's easy for you to talk about learning from the past when you were part of a generation that had it easier. That did it? A murmur ran through the room, not in Keller's favor. A few guests exchanged glances, unimpressed by the bold but flimsy argument. Eastwood let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Easier. He repeated the word like it was the dumbest thing he'd heard all night. I started in Hollywood when they still told actors like me to change their name because it sounded too rough. I worked as a bricklayer before I ever got in front of a camera. You think it was easier? He let the words hang for a beat. You ever had to shovel asphalt in the middle of summer just to afford a meal? Keller blinked. He had not been prepared for that, but Eastwood wasn't done. I've seen guys like you before, he said, taking another sip of his drink, looking for a sound bite, hoping to make a scene. But here's the thing. You walked in here thinking I was going to fold, that I'd get mad, stumble over my words, maybe even storm off. But he shrugged. I don't do performances on command. That's your job. The audience laughed again. This time not just a few but nearly half the room. A couple of guests actually applauded. Keller felt it, that creeping awareness that this wasn't going the way he planned, and it was about to get worse. Brandon Keller's confidence cracked, but he refused to show it. He forced a smirk, adjusting his posture like he still had control. But the problem was he had already lost. He just hadn't figured it out yet. He cleared his throat, reaching for anything to regain momentum. All right, so maybe you had some struggles, he said. His voice not as sharp as before. But don't you think there's a reason people your age are being left behind in Hollywood? Maybe audiences don't want outdated ideas shoved down their throats anymore. Eastwood let out a short chuckle. The kind that wasn't amused, just disappointed. Left behind, he repeated, shaking his head. Son, I've outlived entire Hollywood trends. Been written off more times than I can count. And yet here I am, and here you are. Talking to me at my table, at my event, using my name to try and make a headline. Keller had no response to that. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Damn." The moment stretched and the weight of it settled in. Keller's audience wasn't on his side anymore. They weren't nodding along, waiting for him to take down a Hollywood relic. They were watching him squirm. The silence became unbearable. So Keller scrambled for an escape. I just think people deserve better, he blurted out. Better stories, better representation, better. Eastwood cut him off with a slow, knowing nod. So tell him one. Keller blinked. What? You keep saying what people don't want, so tell him what they do want. Eastwood leaned back in his chair. Go ahead right now. Say something that'll matter more than the movies I've made, the people I've worked with, or the history I've been a part of. The words hit like a gut punch. Keller had nothing. His hands curled slightly at his sides, his breath uneven. His entire game had been about tearing someone else down. But now, standing in front of Clint Eastwood, he was being asked to build something instead, and he couldn't do it. A small, humiliating bead of sweat formed at his temple. He tried to ignore the way the room felt smaller, the way people were whispering, the way his own plan had turned against him. Thought so, Eastwood finally said, picking up his drink again. The crowd laughed once more. But this time it wasn't just amusement. It was finality. The conversation was over. Keller had lost and he knew it. Brandon Keller swallowed hard, the heat of humiliation spreading across his face. He had walked into this confrontation, certain that he'd come out looking like the voice of a new era. Instead, he stood there, exposed, stripped down to nothing but a young man who had overestimated himself in the presence of someone who had already seen it all. The chatter in the room had shifted. Conversations resumed, laughter hummed through the air. But every now and then eyes flicked back toward him, some amused, some pitying, others just indifferent. Keller hated that last one the most because that meant he wasn't even worth the outrage. Without another word, he turned on his heel and disappeared into the crowd. No goodbyes, no last words, no grand exit. Just a man who had overplayed his hand and lost in front of an audience. Eastwood watched him go, expression unreadable. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even seem particularly invested in the outcome. He simply took another sip of his drink. Then turned back to the veteran he had been speaking to before the interruption. Now he said like nothing had happened. You were saying something about your time in Fallujah. And just like that, the moment passed. But a few feet away, a middle-aged producer shook his head, chuckling. You know, he said. You didn't have to do him like that. Eastwood raised an eyebrow. I didn't do anything. The producer smirked. Oh, come on. You let that kid walk right into a buzzsaw. Eastwood finally cracked a small grin. He walked into it himself, he said. I just didn't move it out of the way. The producer laughed, nodding in agreement. You know they'll twist this, he said. Make you look like the bad guy. Eastwood gave a small shrug. They've been doing that for years, he said simply. Doesn't change the truth. Across the room, another guest muttered to a friend. Man, these people really think they can out-talk Clint Eastwood. The friend chuckled, shaking his head. They keep trying though, but every time the outcome was the same. The night carried on as these nights always did. Champagne flowed, deals were whispered over candlelit tables, and the hum of Hollywood's elite filled the room once more. But one lesson lingered. Not just for Brandon Keller but for everyone who had watched the exchange unfold. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about generations. It wasn't even about winning or losing. It was about wisdom versus arrogance. Clint Eastwood had seen it all. Hard work, rejection, grit, success, failure, resilience. He had lived long enough to understand that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the one with something worth saying. Brandon Keller. He was part of a world where performative outrage was currency. Where calling someone out was easier than doing something meaningful. He thought he could walk into a room, throw around some buzzwords and tear down a legend. But the problem with tearing something down, it doesn't mean you've built anything. And that was Keller's mistake. He had spent his time waiting for someone else to fall instead of learning how to stand on his own. By the time he slipped out of the gala, he was just another name in a long list of people who had underestimated the old cowboy. Clint Eastwood didn't need to prove anything. He never did. He let his work speak for itself, let time be the judge of what mattered, and let the people who tried to erase history fade into irrelevance on their own. Because in the end, it's not about who screams the loudest. It's about who actually has something to say. The world is full of people looking for their gotcha moment, quick to criticize, quick to cancel, but slow to actually contribute. But here's the truth. Tearing someone down doesn't make you important. Building something real does. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you appreciate stories that remind us why wisdom still matters, hit that subscribe button. Because some voices, they don't fade with time, they only get stronger.